We respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we work and learn, and pay respect to the First Nations peoples and their elders past, present, and future. We're recording on Gadigal land. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
Welcome back to episode 3 of Rewind's look back to 1990 and the release of one of Australia's finest and most important albums, the debut Charcoal Lane by the great Archie Roach. I'm Steve Bell. These docu-series podcasts are always best experienced in their entirety and in order, so if you haven't checked out episodes 1 and 2, it's best if you give those a listen before diving in here.
She comes here every day, this little lady with hair of grey, and she just smiles and shuffles on her way. Through these hospital corridors, she walks along these lonely floors to a bed where an old man used to lay, and an old man used to say, I'm in the summer of my life, I've seen the good times, I've seen the strife, I've just been under the surgeon's knife. Please don't cry, my darling.
We learned how throughout these trials and tribulations, music had been a constant for Archie, an escape, a comfort, a way of bringing people together. And when he'd finally come out of the other side of his battle, sober and renewed, all of the things he'd experienced, good and bad, came pouring out in his songs, beautiful and expressive art flowering from this lifetime of trauma and marginalisation. In the first 2 episodes, we traced Archie Roach's career path, starting with his childhood, exploring the tragedy of him becoming part of the lost and disenfranchised stolen generations when he was torn from the arms of his loving family at the age of 2 and thrown into the foster system by seemingly heartless government bureaucrats, and how, after his eventual quest for identity and culture and country became a downward spiral of drinking and displacement, he was saved by both his own strength and the love of his late partner Ruby Hunter. And once these songs started seeping out into the public domain and flooring everyone with both their message and eloquence, it was only a matter of time until Archie was ushered into the spotlight. But this was fast-tracked by Oz Rock heroes Paul Kelly and Steve Connolly, whose faith and belief in Archie was so strong that they took it upon themselves to make this dream a reality. They introduced themselves into Archie's world, then introduced Archie to their crowd, after which they set their eyes on a bigger prize, making these songs into an album, a calling card to help introduce Archie and his music to the rest of the country and beyond. We've heard how they earned Archie's trust and friendship, swapping country songs around his family kitchen table, established there was material enough for a record, and, with a nudge from Ruby, convinced Archie that this was a worthwhile challenge and one he was more than equipped to take on. The next phase, or as Paul alluded to last episode, most likely a concurrent one, was convincing Paul and Steve's label Mushroom Records to take a chance on the basically unknown singer-songwriter. But with their unbridled enthusiasm for the project, no doubt helped by the fact that at this stage in early 1990, Paul Kelly and the Messengers were one of the biggest acts in Australia, it wasn't too hard of a sell. Before we dive into the ensuing relationship between Archie and Mushroom, one that stretches unbroken to the present day, one of my favourite parts of this whole incredible Charcoal Lane story takes place right at the beginning of that union. Paul and Steve have convinced Mushroom to take a punt on Archie, and the label has agreed, at which point it's contract time. Archie didn't have a manager yet. He'd been plucked essentially from nowhere. His career hadn't even really started. So he asked the person he trusted most with these things, and someone who knew these people in this world, to come with him to meet the label, just to keep an eye on proceedings. Paul. Here's Archie recounting how it went down.
Yeah, we went in there. They said, okay, you're going to do an album with us. They presented me with this contract and was reading through it. And I'm looking at it, reading through it, and it was all gobbledygook to me. Yeah, but I was thinking, all right, yeah, it seems okay. And I was going to sign it. And Paul said, oh, can I have a look at this? I said, oh, okay, but. And Paul browsing through it. It took a little while. Again, back at the lawyer and says, oh, I think we can do a little bit better than this. Yeah. And I didn't know what he was talking about, but I said, oh, okay then. And the lad looked at me and said, what do you think, Archie? I said, look, I don't know nothing about contracts and whatnot, but Paul, I think, knows a little bit more than me, so I'll go with Paul. And yeah, they came back with something that was a little better. Or Paul thought, well, this is much better, or a little better anyway. Yeah.
It's nice to have someone like that fighting in your corner.
Well, it was nice. It was, like I said, I hadn't had a manager and hadn't even thought about management back then, because that was a whole other ball game. That's for sure.
There's just something awesome about that image to me, of Paul standing by his mate and telling his own label, the people backing his career who'd been involved in all of his albums so far, that they could do better, and instructing Archie not to sign the initial contract. Paul, as is his wont, plays down his role in proceedings.
Well, they just presented the standard contract at the time, and Archie and Ricky were like ready to sign on the spot. I said, don't sign on the spot. Let's take this away and just get it looked over by a lawyer. So it was just due diligence. We didn't knock back the contract. We said, hang on, you don't have to sign right here. We'll take it away and we'll get a lawyer to look at it. So that's what we did, and changed this and that. But it was a pretty standard first record contract. So that's what happened.
Gerard Shalaki, who, as we've heard, is currently tour director for Frontier Touring, but back then was Paul Kelly and soon Archie Roach's booking agent for Premier artists, Frontier and Premier both existing as the touring arms of the Mushroom Group, is not surprised at all by Paul's allegiance to Archie, his friend and fellow artist.
That's exactly right, but it can be fraught, the record business, and to have somebody with you. I mean, Archie and Paul were friends, and that's what friends do. They look out for their mates, and hey, come along with me and check it out. What do you think? And to see Paul's opinion that he knows and trusts, and then for Paul to have that reaction is a beautiful thing. And and I think the record label were probably expecting it, to be honest. I mean, there's also a great scene, sort of on a comparable level in the Tom Petty documentary that Peter Bogdanovich made, where there's a scene in the studio with Roger McGuinn, and Tom Petty's in there in the studio with Roger, and a record label guy's there, and the record label guys said something to Roger, and Tom just stands up and completely berates him and says, this is Roger McGuinn. How dare you speak to this person like this? You don't know what you've got, and totally puts the guy back in his box. And, and that's artists looking after artists and standing up for them. And, Paul and Archie, there you go.
And in terms of Paul bringing in another artist to the label and going into bat for him like that, Gerard reckons that such altruism is completely par for the course.
Paul Kelly is one of those artists that he's an explorer. He's always on the lookout. He's always listening out for new artists, including artists on all the bills when he tours. He pays real good attention to who's on stage with him, and he always has a say in it. And he'll give a break to all these wonderful young performers, whether it be Alice Skye, whether it be Emma Donovan, who's appearing on the upcoming Making Gravy shows. And then he has them up on stage with him as well, performing. He's so inclusive with all of that stuff. So it comes as no surprise whatsoever. It's just how Paul rolls.
Now, obviously, and sadly in the circumstances, no discussion of Mushroom Records or the Mushroom family can be had without talking about Michael Gudinski, Mushroom's founder and spiritual figurehead, from its formation in 1972 right through until his tragic passing earlier this year, 2021. We've mentioned in this podcast already the huge holes left in the Australian music scene by the sad passing of Ruby Hunter and Steve Connolly, and such voids don't come any bigger than that left by Michael. He was a giant of the Australian music scene, loved by all of his artists, loved by all he worked with and plenty of others who came into his orbit, respected by everyone else, and a massive supporter of Archie Roach ever since Paul brought him into the fold all those years ago. In 2020, to celebrate Charcoal Lane's 30th anniversary, and unable to tour because of COVID, Archie recorded a series of Zoom interviews with key players in the album's story, and one of those was with Michael. They're all up on Archie's YouTube channel, and Archie's kindly given us permission to use this short section of the chat with Michael discussing the beginning of this long and fruitful relationship.
I've been fortunate enough to be part of the journey throughout, to be honest with you. And it's obviously as the head of the Mushroom Group. It goes way back to, I think, Gerard, who was an agent at Premier at the time, was very, very keen and supportive, and was for many years and still is of you. And you were on a show with Paul Kelly, and I've listened to a couple of your chats that you've been doing, and I found it quite amazing that you didn't know who Paul Kelly was, but you certainly knew who his songs were. And Paul Kelly was a major influence in a number of artists, but particularly you. And Steve Connolly, who passed away very, very young, we had the greatest respect for, and he was as involved in that album as Paul, with yourself. And I remember the genuine excitement when Simon B, Eleanor, a number of people that were, when that album came in, it was a very emotional album for you, obviously. It was, as it turns out, it's a historic album that's relevance is more than ever. As I heard today on Radio National, they played Down City Streets, which was written by your late and great wife, I believe.
That's right.
And it's been a long journey, a journey of people around me that have really, really loved being part of it. Pierre Baroni, I remember he'd been in our art department for a few months, and he did that amazing cover, which to this day, you know, we miss it. It's great that vinyl's back in action because you can touch it and feel it.
Exactly.
So Aurora Records was one of our labels, and it's been a and there's still a bit to come, but it's been an amazing journey for yourself on every level, health-wise. Everything we've felt with you, with Ruby. You've had two amazing women, apart from your late wife, around you, being both your managers. That Jill Shelton, if she was here, she knows it. I only haven't shaved because of lockdown in Melbourne, but I would give Jill the biggest hug, mate. She's an absolute partner of yours for forever. Anyway, so I do remember a lot about it, and boy, it's come a long way.
Yeah. Look, I remember the early days. You know, at Albert Park there. Well, you know, going up to and talking to Simon B and Eleanor back in the day, and getting up and meet you the first time. Well, I hadn't met you. I'd heard about you, but hadn't really met you until the ARIAs, when Charcoal Lane got that ARIA award for best Indigenous album and also best new talent. So, and I met you on.
I was pretty emotional that night for you, mate. It was. I had dropped into a meeting or two in our famous boardroom down the stairs, and I loved the thing you wrote in the book, which is so true about me. You loved the passion. You couldn't understand half of what I said, so I've always had a pretty husky voice, but it really, I know how much it meant to you and how much it meant to the community, but what it meant to the people around you, not just the people that were fans of that record, but people in the office. There were so many fans of the album, and they were just, so pleased. And it really would have, imagine it would have meant so much to you to see that, the whole thing become a reality that most probably was a dream, to be honest, I think. And it was great when great dreams come true, and this dream's continuing, mate, and we'll both be there to either of us drop, I could promise you.
That sadly came true far too quickly, but the mutual respect there is abundantly obvious. Now, during that clip, when Michael and Archie were discussing Archie's key supporters in his early time at Mushroom, they both name-checked Eleanor, and they were talking about Eleanor McKay. These days, she's the editor of a regional newspaper, but she was a long-term part of the Mushroom family, rising to the role of general manager of the Mushroom labels. But back when Charcoal Lane came out, as she explains, she'd just taken a new role as national promotions manager for alternative music.
I started working with Archie as soon as they signed him. So what was that, 1990, I think? So without boring you, but in 1990, at the start of 1990, I moved to Melbourne to work at the Mushroom office in Melbourne. Prior to that, I'd been in Sydney. So I did all the publicity for Charcoal Lane. So I started there. Anyway, when I moved to Mushroom Melbourne, they started me as sort of like alternative. I was called the alternative promotions manager. That was me, national promotions manager for alternative music or something. I don't know, some crazy title. Anyway, so I worked on art, like right from the start. I worked from Archie, and then I went on to, become general manager of White. So then I worked. So I worked on like the first 4 albums in one form or another. But because I was in Sydney, I think when Archie first got signed, he was already signed by the time I came along. That's a very long and involved way of saying that. And Paul brought him to the label, basically. Yeah. Paul and Steve Connolly came in saying, this guy's incredible. We want to, you should sign him. We want to do a record with him. I mean, when you've got someone like Paul on the label, when he comes to you with an artist, he doesn't do it lightly, like he comes with things that he feels are really important. And so, it carries a lot of weight, So when Paul arrives in saying, this is something that I think you should listen to, everybody actually kind of downs tools and really does listen. And then you just... Archie's voice was so incredible. And like I said, he was already signed by the time I came on board, but I remember going to see him and he supported Paul. And it was just stunning. When somebody, he came out and he sang Took the Children Away, and the whole crowd just went quiet. People just genuinely were completely gobsmacked. And, that kind of thing, you get the hair goes up on the back of your neck. And so I think everybody had that reaction to him, and you don't get that often, there's always that you get that sort of hip young band and it's all exciting, but Archie was something different. And I don't think it was that hard to spot it, And the really nice thing about Mushroom, because we ended up with this, we had Yothu Yindi, we had Archie, with Archie came Ruby, obviously. And and Christine Anu. And they were just all incredibly talented, amazing musicians. And it's actually only in retrospect that I look back at it and go, it's actually pretty amazing that Mushroom signed all of those artists, because when you look at what was happening around us, those kind of artists weren't getting signed. But at the time, they just seemed like incredible artists. And that's why they were signed, not necessarily because they were Indigenous, or I don't know, maybe I'm just naive, but certainly never in my time at Mushroom was there, talk about we have to sign a certain sort of artist, or we have to support Indigenous music, or, it was just if people believed that the artist was really good, then that was the thing with Michael, like he said, he would say, like I hired you because you're good at what you do. Now go out and do it. He didn't really want to second guess all your choices. And that doesn't mean to say he didn't give you a bollocking if your choice was wrong, but he backed people, if he hired people. And I think probably it was Simon Bates who was the main person with Archie, because Paul would have brought it to Simon. Then Michael would have just backed Simon because Simon believed the record was good.
That belief and backing was imperative because Charcoal Lane didn't ship millions of units straight off the bat. It was never going to. A lot of labels talk about nurturing the acts they sign and being in it for the long haul, but when push comes to shove, commerce usually prevails over art. But Eleanor explains that Mushroom really did tend to stick with their artists, especially through the early years.
I mean, Michael's, loyal to a fault, so he would stick with artists in a way that, other record companies wouldn't, and I mean, even before I worked at Mushroom, that was probably one of the things that I really, I come from a very indie background, and so, major record companies were scary to me. But one of the things I noticed about Mushroom was that they stuck with their artists. So they had this, especially, in the 80s, they had this whole raft of them. So there was Paul himself, so Paul was album number 4 before they really had a hit. So he did the 2 albums with the Dots and then posted. The Models were another one who really, I mean, they didn't kind of even deliver a sort of critical hit until 3 or so albums in, and then they had the massive hit with, Out of Mind, Out of Sight. Hunters, so there was really there was a history of that with Mushroom where, like if Michael, like I said, if he liked it, or someone that Michael trusted liked them, then he would hang in there with an artist. So, and also, Mushroom didn't really have a whole lot of hits. It was really only when Kylie came along that there were sort of big money hits. So, the bands were all about, getting out and playing live, and, and if they could perform live, then, I mean, I think that was one of the first things we did with Archie. We put him out on the road. It was such a strange combination with Frente and this other little band called Helvellyn, and they just went, and Mick Newton, I don't know if you've spoken to Mick, he'd be worth having a word to, who runs Day on the Green. So Mick was the agent in at Premier Artists, and Mick put together these little shows, and they were either called Turn Off Your Telly or Turn On Your Radio, but they went to just all of these little regional venues, and they just played all over the country. And all 3 artists were on White Records. And so, so we were kind of figuring that we weren't going to get commercial radio. It was actually just about getting them in front of people. And so, Archie would go and play all these amazing sort of things with Paul. And I think, Gerard would have been plugging him onto every international tour that he could, because once you saw him, then he had a kind of fan for life. And then, you know, on the other side of it, we were just putting him out in front of sort of every little indie crowd that you could get. And White Records, we didn't really have the hits. I used to say to Michael that we were good for his credibility, not for his bank balance.
Charcoal Lane would eventually come out on Aurora, a small sub-label of Mushroom that was formed for the project and existed for a few years in the 90s, putting out records by Archie, Chris Wilson, Chris Bailey of the Saints, Neil Murray, and a couple of other acts. According to Eleanor, this being simply a measure to keep those artists separate from the pop acts on the roster.
I think initially, what became White Records didn't exist at that point. So there was this idea that they wanted to create a sub-label of Mushroom that would sort of deal more with heritage stuff, or, you know, because Mushroom at that point, if you look at what was, you know, having the hits, you got the Shantuzis and Kylie and, you know, like Jimmy, bless him, and all of that. But there was a whole lot of artists who sort of didn't fit in there. And what had been White Label Records, which is where Hunters had started and everything, that had kind of just dissipated. And so Simon B came up with this idea that he wanted to relaunch the White Label, and that became White Records. But I think before that even got up and running, they'd already signed Archie, and they needed to, you know, create a spot for him that wasn't next to the Shantuzis, and that's where the Aurora thing came from. And so I think Simon B and Pierre Baroni worked on that a lot. Because, yeah, like I said, initially I was like, you know, I worked on that record as an alternative promotions manager. And then I remember Simon coming to me and saying, you know, I want to start White Records, and we'll kind of operate completely separately to the main Mushroom thing. Would you come and work with me? But I think Archie was already out before we did that. So I think it was, in lots of ways, it was sort of a marketing thing. But it was probably the beginning of Simon B really trying to, you know, kind of set up an alternative section of Mushroom. And, you know, Michael was, like, at the same time, all of this stuff was exploding, you know, where, you know, like Nirvana was exploding. And, you know, and even with my role, because, you know, I had been the promotions manager in New South Wales, and for a whole lot of reasons, I was kind of at the end of my tether there. And so they moved me down to Melbourne. And what they'd realised was, because I was, you know, from this indie background, was that I didn't like any of Mushroom's big hits, you know. I was like the inverse barometer. So when I go, I really hate that song, they go, yes, it's going to be a hit. And so they were already looking at this idea that, you know, there was a whole lot of stuff that was coming through that, you know, that didn't fit into radio, that was really only, you know, working through public radio. But it was sort of very rock. So, you know, like, I think like we were importing the Faith No More record and things like that. And, you know, that's not where Archie sat. So you kind of had to find another spot for him. So I think that was the mindset behind it.
It's important to note that Charcoal Lane went gold. That's incredible, and a lot of records. But it was a gradual process. It didn't happen overnight. Gerard agrees that while Mushroom existed as a business should, to make a profit, not every single decision or signing was necessarily dictated by financial concerns.
The way Michael ran Mushroom, that record label wasn't governed with their signings as far as what's going to make money, and therefore do we sign it. If it's not going to make money, well, we're not going to sign it. That's the complete antithesis of how that label ran, and is run, by the way. It's still the same these days. Seeing something like Archie Roach, an artist like Archie Roach, was something that it was tailor-made for what Michael wanted on that label, which is to give a voice to wonderful artists like that, and to look after them as well. It was never about, okay, well, your deal's done, see you later. It was always about, great, let's just keep going, like a real, he really sponsored a lot of these people in a way, and it was always about, we know it's a great record and we know you're a great artist and we're so proud to have you in our company and for us working with you. And that's what makes a great record label. It's about long-term thinking. It's about the artist. It's always about the artist.
We'll discuss in the following episodes the sociological and political importance of charcoal laying, a relevance which has only grown with the passing of time. But Eleanor remembers that everyone working closely with Archie at Mushroom was pretty much aware of this from the get-go.
It actually won a Human Rights Award, Took the Children Away, and it won that really early, like it was probably 91, 92. And I mean, I think it's a bit like, Yothu Yindi with Treaty, like when that record came along and especially when they did that remix, you kind of knew something was going on, like even if you couldn't quite put your finger on it, and I mean, that's the thing with, if you've worked around music all your life, you can do the same things for a whole batch of records, but one of them just goes, and you can, it's the old, you can feel it in your bones when it's about to happen, and you often don't know why. And I was actually just saying it to someone else about another project just last week. I said, nothing sells itself. I've worked with too many great artists to, and seen them not sell, to know that being good is not enough to make you successful commercially. So you have to do all of this stuff. You have to keep, pumping it out and spreading the message and build enough momentum. And then when it goes, just get out of the way and, let it do its thing. So I think we knew with Archie that it was a really significant record. And he was telling a story that people weren't very aware of, but we'd already seen with Paul, how a song like that, like From Little Things, Big Things Grow, or Maralinga, that, there was a whole Australian history bound up in songs, and Archie came along and, added this incredible song. And, it was a very palatable way to tell people about a really unpalatable story. And on top of that, Archie himself was very generous in the way he spoke about it, the way he talked about it. He's very zen about things. Whereas, say, Ruby was much more vocal, much more angry about what had happened. Archie was very forgiving and sort of very forward looking about it. He just wanted things to be better in the future. He didn't really, and I think, if that made a really big impact as well, his actual general demeanor was pretty significant. I don't know.
I agree 100%. Like, especially on Charcoal Lane, he's not trying to shove anything down your throat or change anything. He's just saying, this is my story, this is what happened. And it invites empathy. And through that, that's when you get attached to the story, Yeah. And it's really special.
Yeah. And there were things going on around it. Like, I remember going to see him play at a, concert that they did for Nelson Mandela when he came out. And, it was, Archie performing, Nelson Mandela speaking, and Reuben Hurricane Carter, talking, like, it was astounding. So, and I think there had been a private reception, but I went to like the big thing, and it was, it was early in my times at Melbourne, so my my geographical senses weren't so good. But it was a stadium. We were outside, like at a Docklands kind of thing. Like, it was big. We weren't in some little hall somewhere, and there were just thousands of people there. And Nelson Mandela, it was like a rock star. So when you look at that stuff and you go, all of this stuff is happening. Yothu Yindi had that incredible impact with treaty. You had stuff like where Nelson Mandela's going around the world and talking, and thousands of people are showing up. I think, you look at it now and you go, it's a little depressing that we haven't moved further than we have. But, there was quite a groundswell there of people wanting to know what happened and wanting to, make things better. And there were some really significant artists who were, taking up the cause. Midnight Oil and Paul, and you had those Warumpi band breakthroughs, and Neil Murray. Like, there was a lot of them around, and Neil was on the label as well. So you kind of end up with a bit of a critical mass, and I think that helps as well.
Eleanor also remembers that while support for Archie was huge in the cities, and even extended to the numerous international dignitaries that he encountered early on, there was also a lot of love for both Archie and Charcoal Lane in rural areas, and of course the many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities around the nation.
I think probably the only other thing is that the international artists, the significance of Archie to them seemed almost, like bigger than it did in Australia. So when you look at the people that he supported, so that would have been, Michael and Gerard sending off, CDs, but the list, when I had a look back through my files, and the list of people he supported, and it was Tracy Chapman and Joan Armatrading and Bob Dylan and, just all sorts of, really big artists. And so he was, and they were saying, we want him on our show, so. And I remember him going to Canada and doing like Banff and playing with all of these incredible artists. So there was always that big international thing where maybe, Australia might have been a little bit slower to pick up. But I think, he got a lot of attention internationally, where maybe, there's a bit of, I don't know whether it's guilt here that people, I don't know. Let's not go there with why we're so bad at reconciliation. But when it's not in your backyard, you can maybe embrace it in a way that people here were a bit more hesitant. But a bit like Paul, I don't think he ever got commercial radio airplay. Other than all of those great guys who used to do the Australian music shows late at night. And the other one who was really supportive was Ed Nimmervoll at MCM. And Ed used to do those syndicated shows that would go to just radio stations, all across the country. Because that's probably the only other thing worth mentioning is that, Archie did really well in the country. He did really well on country radio. So so all of those weird little AM stations that normally you wouldn't kind of bother too much about, Archie did really well with them, and I remember, we kind of made a point of, back in those days, you could sell CDs into the truck stops, so you made sure that you put Archie into those sort of places, and even, I remember, because I grew up in the country, and my uncle, said to me one day, I've been listening to that fella that you worked on. That's a bloody great record, isn't it? and he bought it in a Shell petrol station or something as he was driving out to Broken Hill or whatever. So that was a thing with Archie. He did do very well in those kind of areas. So he had that double thing going where he had the inner city latte sipping, like the woke people, but he also had this really, big thing out in the country, and obviously then in the community too. It took me a long time to figure out that he actually wasn't related to 8 million people, because everybody was like, my Uncle Archie, and I'm like, how many nieces and nephews do you have? And then, of course, I worked out that he was everybody's uncle.
Gerard even believes that the stories and attendant messages woven throughout Charcoal Lane are important enough that they should be introduced to our nation's classrooms.
No one tells that story, or no one was telling that story at all. And then to have it presented to you in such a succinct fashion, in this beautiful song with an incredible melody, beautifully performed with Archie's voice front and centre. And it's interesting you say from a political basis. I mean, just lately, of course, you've been reading sort of references to the people in government at the moment carrying on about curriculums for schools and all the rest of it, and you know how history, in inverted commas, should be framed. I certainly couldn't think of a better thing to do than to include Charcoal Lane in any curriculum in any school, and have a bunch of those songs be studied and pulled apart and stories told and discussed, because it really cuts to the chase. All of those songs really explain what was going on with Archie's people, and maybe that's what they should start considering, as opposed to sort of, you know, putting a blanket over the whole damn thing.
We'll leave episode 3 there and finish with the album's title track, Charcoal Lane, one of Archie's elegant rememberings of his drinking days in the streets and alleyways of 80s inner city Melbourne.
Side by side, we'd walk along to the end of Gertrude Street, and we'd tarpaul and muster for a quart of wine. Thick or thin, right or wrong, in the cold and in the heat, we'd cross over Smith Street to the end of the line. Then we'd laugh and sing, do anything to take away the pain, trying to keep it down as it first went down in Charcoal Lane. Spinning yarns and telling jokes, now the wine is tasting good, 'cause it's getting closer and closer to its end. Have a sip and roll some smokes, we'd smoke tailor-mades if we could, but we just made do with some city street blend. Then we'd all chuck in and we'd start to grin when we had enough to do it again. But if things got tight, then we had to bite for Charcoal Lane. Up Gertrude Street, we'd walk once more with just a few cents short, and we'd stop at the builders to see who we could see. Then we'd bite around until we'd score a flagon of McWilliamsport, enough to take away our misery. And we'd all get drunk, oh so drunk, and maybe a little insane, and we'd stagger home all alone, and the next day we'd do it again, have a revival in Charcoal Lane. I'm a survivor of Charcoal Lane.
Okay, thanks for checking out episode 3 of Rewind's Look Back at Charcoal Lane. Thanks as always to our network partners, Yamaha Headphones. We'll catch you all really soon.
Rewind with Steve Bell is a Euphony podcast, produced by Craig Trewick and Andrew Mars, recorded and engineered by Zig Parker, theme music by Della Bar. For more Euphony podcasts, visit our website, Spotify, Apple, Acast, or wherever you get your podcasts.